said to all of those who were on earlier today, this is Jikai Dehn, who is joining us from Australia. He's a Tendai monk, and more than that, he has a very firm grasp on the importance of the intellectual foundation of the early Tendai movement, something, as many of you will know, is very close to Karen and my own work in terms of preserving and expanding the Swedenborgian, you know, encouraging deep dives into Swedenborgian topics and Swedenborgian ways. And what's more is the school that he represents, which is one of the largest, and I would argue, even not necessarily in terms of numbers, but in terms of cultural reception, Tendai is really the origin of many other of the 13 schools. And Jikai is undergoing, supporting right now a translation series, which the library will buy as well, which explains and translates many of Saicho's work, who's the founder of Tendai, not Zhi, which is Zhi, but I cannot pronounce Chinese to save my life, but it sounds like Chur. He was the founder of Tendai. And yeah, so Saicho, when he received it in Japan, it really spread like wildfire. And we had last year a Nichiren priest who's one of these groups, Shin Buddhism, which maybe some of you are familiar with, that all has its origin in the world of medieval Tendai. And what I will say that about this is, many of you know, I'm currently working on a project about Swedenborgianism in Japan amongst non-Christian readers. And Tendai monks and Shingon monks were very excited by Swedenborg's revelation. And they interpreted Swedenborg through the lens of Mikyo. And in many cases, they felt it's Tamitsu is the Tendai one. They thought that Tendai esoteric Buddhism, Tamitsu, was identical to what Swedenborg was saying, and this becomes the foundation of what later movements like Omoto, which we've talked about, we'll talk about again at the end of next year. This was a popular explosion of interest in Swedenborg in the Meiji period, and it went right until the Showa period, to the war. But with that, we now get the wonder of listening to him. And thank you so very much for talking with us. And welcome, Jikai.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm fascinated to read the work that you're working on there, Del, once it comes together. That's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Okay, so I will try to share my screen now, just so that we have that all together. Okay. All right. So just to confirm, everyone can see my slides there? Yes, that's all good? Wonderful, wonderful. Okay. So thank you for having me here today. I want to say at the outset, I know that Tendai Buddhism is perhaps not in everyone's wheelhouse this morning, but even if that is the case for your good selves, I hope that I'll be able to provide a rather interesting perspective in this overview of what is a fairly profound religious tradition. Now, as you can see here on the first slide, Dr. David Chappell puts it quite nicely, I think, when he says that although Tendai has a reputation of being a major denomination in Japanese history and the most comprehensive and diversified school of Chinese Buddhism, it's almost unknown in the West. This meager presence is in marked contrast to the vision of the founder of the movement in China, that is Tiantai, who provided a religious framework which seemed suited to adapt to other cultures, to evolve new practices, and to universalize Buddhism. Now, Del mentioned it in his introduction there, but just so that everyone is aware, I will be using two terms, Tiantai and Tendai. Now, those terms can technically be used interchangeably, but Tiantai is simply the Chinese label, the Chinese reading of the characters of the mountain on which this school was founded in the Sui dynasty. And as you see there by Dr. Zipperin at Chicago University, near Del there, It's the first attempt at a thoroughgoing Sinitic reworking of Indian Buddhism, meaning that it's the first time in Chinese history that Chinese Buddhists felt confident enough in their understanding of Buddhism not to merely transplant Indian schools and ideas, but to make their own claims. And Tendai, on the other hand, that term Tendai is merely the Japanese reading of the Chinese Tiantai, but naturally we can distinguish the Japanese school, which is brought to Japan by Saicho a few hundred years later there. And you can see the images of their likeness on the right there. That is the transmission scroll that we receive when we ordain. Okay. Now, just before we dive into the nitty-gritty, I do want to say we have a limited talk here. So two things that I probably can't achieve in the short scope of this talk is a textbook overview of the whole tradition, as it were. And I also can't really give anything like a comprehensive treatment. That would require a great deal of discussion on our part. So what I would like to do today is lay out those fundamental commitments of the Tiantai Tendai tradition, because by being aware of those whys and those underpinnings, you'll be able to plug in, you'll have a framework of access points from which you will be able to plug in some of those ideas that you may explore elsewhere after this talk. Oops, sorry. So first, it's worth looking at the whys of the tradition. So as we said, this is the first quintessentially East Asian movement of Buddhism. But as I'm sure you're aware, usually in religious history, people don't set out to do something new. They set out to understand what's been bequeathed to them in some kind of sense. So it's worth us asking what motivates the tradition in its founding and in its transmission to Japan, for example. Why did people brave stormy seas and tsunami-plagued waters to bring this type of material to Japan? What is it that they hope to make sense of in a unique way? So, as many of you are aware, in East Asia we have the Chinese Buddhist canon, the Da Zhang Jing. So this is the Chinese language collection of Buddhist scriptures used in East Asia. Now, broadly speaking, this is made up of three collections. One is the sutras, that is the discourses or sermons of the Buddha. Many of you are probably aware of that word sutra in things like the Kama Sutra. That's not a Buddhist text, but sutra means a thread. So a sermon is a thread because it carries on a particular theme. It's united by a theme. Karma in this case is desire. So the Kama Sutra is the desire sermon. The next basket that makes up this collection is the Vinaya. So this is the disciplinary codes and precepts of Buddhists, both monastic and laity. And then finally, we have the Shastras. These are the commentarial literature written by Indian masters and by East Asians on those first two baskets, the sermons and the disciplinary codes. Now, the Chinese Buddhist canon was translated between the 1st and 7th centuries AD. So in reality, it isn't a single canon. It is multiple attempts by multiple translators over many years in China, Korea, and Japan to transmit the body of Indian and Central Asian literature to East Asia. Now, the image that I have there is of a famous example, the Tripitaka Koreana, and I've just put it there to give us a sense of the scope of this canon. So this particular example is 81,258 wooden printing blocks. It's still extant. It was made in the 13th century. It contains 1,496 texts, which are divided into 6,568 books that span 81,258 pages for a total of 52,330,152 Chinese characters. Now, while that might sound like a great many texts, this is not a canon that includes every text transmitted to East Asia. The canon used in scholarly work today is usually the Taisho Shinshu Daizokyo, which was made in early modern Japan. This canon itself was a massive undertaking. It took 12 years, from 1922 to 1934. It had 300 dedicated scholars whose sole job during that time was to compile and edit this canon. And there were 450,000 other individuals who assisted on that project, formatters, collectors, editors, and so forth. It is a massive, massive collection. And the final product of this work was 100 print volumes containing 2,184 texts. Now, even that canon has been criticized for not being extensive enough. And since the 1930s, there have been multiple canons that have been collated to supplement that textual corpus. Now, why is all of that relevant, you might wonder, to what we're talking about today? Well, one of the unique features perhaps of Buddhism, which may not be the same for all faiths necessarily, is that at its genesis is an appeal to a human authority. So, as you probably are aware, we have the person of Siddhartha Gautama, who is said to have liberated himself from existential suffering by realizing profound truths about the nature of existence. And it's on the basis of that realization, therefore, that he receives the title Buddha, that is, one who is aware. Bodhi is the root there, awareness. And given the tradition's authority has a human origin, there's no divine protection in any sense for the maintenance of this written word, spoken word, down to posterity. There is therefore an incredibly strong commitment on the one hand to drawing close to the actual words of the Buddha bequeathed to his disciples. And this is based on a trust or faith in not only his words themselves, but also in those all too human descendants being able to transmit faithfully that canon down to the present. Now, for reference, if any of you have visited Buddhist temples, this is why one of our key practices has always been to recite Buddhist texts, because one memorizes this material and transmits it word of mouth from disciple to disciple down the line. Also, of course, if you've read any Buddhist texts, you're probably familiar with the fact that they all start with the Sanskrit phrase, evam maya shrutam, which in English is usually translated to something like, thus have I heard, or this I have heard. The I speaking here is Ananda, the Buddha's personal attendant, who was supposed to be present at all of his sermons. So even though this might function today as a bit of a throwaway convention at the beginning of sutras, it is an act of faith. Thus have I heard. Thus has been transmitted. This is important because Buddhism, therefore, has this huge commitment inherently to believing, in some sense, what has been transmitted in the scriptures. There is a faith element that is unshakable. Without this pillar, the Buddhist transmission system essentially falls apart. There is no divine protection for the Buddhist canon. It has to be transmitted faithfully down the line. And to illustrate this commitment and how pervasive it is, I've picked 7 examples at random from texts in that canon and translated them for you here. So just very quickly looking here, we have our first text, that which is expounded by the world-honored one is true and not spurious. The second example here, on hearing the exposition of the one vehicle, they're able to deeply believe and accept it. Wherefore, because that which is expounded by all the Buddhas is true and not spurious. Our third example, world-honored one, excellent, excellent. That which is expounded by the Tathagata, that's an epithet for the Buddha, is true, not spurious. I will humbly accept it. My heart now delights in the perfectly awakened Buddhas. That which is expounded by the Buddhas is not contradictory, for it is true, not false. Shariputra, you ought to know that the words of all the Buddhas are not contradictory. You ought to give rise to great strength of faith in the dharmas. Dharma here means doctrines, which have been expounded by the Buddha. The words which are produced by the greatly noble world-honored one are true, not spurious. And finally there, that which has been expounded upon by the world-honored one is true, not spurious. So why have I gone to the trouble of giving you these examples and cluttering this slide with various sources? What is the problem for the faithful Buddhists with this obligation to 2,000 texts and so forth? Well, when we look to these scriptures attributed to the Buddha, we see that there are what appear to be contradictions. I've included one pertinent example here. on the left, we have a sermon of the Buddha called the Lankavatara Sutra. Now, Lanka here refers to the location of that sermon, and that is the island nation which still carries that name to this day, that is Sri Lanka. Okay, so the Lankavatara was preached on that island. And in this text, we have the Buddha speaking to someone named Mahamati about the vehicles, capacities, and realizations taught by the Buddha. Now, just so that we're understanding the moving parts here, a capacity in Buddhist terms refers to the inherent nature of a being, what they are capable of inherently. The realization being spoken of here is the level of awakening that that inherent capacity may achieve if developed appropriately. And the vehicle being talked about here is that method of cultivation, that which conveys one from that inherent capacity to that resultant realization. So here, in our example from the Lankavatara, we have the Buddha saying, furthermore, Mahamati, I expound 5 types of vehicle, capacity, and realization. What are the 5? 1, the vehicle, capacity, and realization of a voice hearer. 2, the vehicle, capacity, and realization of a pratyeka Buddha. 3, the vehicle, capacity, and realization of a thus come one. That's another term for Buddha. 4, the unfixed vehicle, capacity, and realization. And 5, the vehicle of those without capacity or realization. In short, the Buddha is telling Mahamati that he teaches that there are 5 inherent capacities, 4 which can be developed towards particular spiritual fruits with an appropriate vehicle, and 1 kind of individual who lacks capacity to become, as it were, a sage in any meaningful sense. Not that they can't have spiritual attainments, but the levels that we're talking about are not quite what we would call an arya, a noble person. In other words, we have 3 vehicles here. We have 3 different methods of conveyance, 3 different training programs, and 3 different resultant states. Now, very quickly, just so you're aware, what are these vehicles and resultant states? The first one, the vehicle of a voice hearer, is the disciples of a Buddha. They hear his voice, either directly or through the written text. Now, a voice hearer is someone who may become what's called an arhat. That means that they liberate themselves from existential suffering, but they may not understand the nature of reality in the same way that a Buddha does. They do not have omniscient knowledge of the workings of reality. A pratyeka Buddha is a funny category in Buddhism, and it is designed specifically to account for people who are non-Buddhists who have spiritual attainments. A pratyeka Buddha is someone who, on their own, without connection to the Buddhist teachings, awakens to the nature of reality. They don't necessarily teach anyone else, and they do not come from a teaching lineage. They simply observe and attain understanding. And someone who has the capacity for the thus come one, who is in the vehicle of the Buddhas, is someone who not only can liberate themselves from that existential suffering, but can become a Buddha, understand reality, and then teach others the 3 vehicles, these 3 vehicles that are being outlined here. Then on the right, we have what seems to contradict this. We have the Buddha in the Lotus Sutra telling Shariputra the following: all the Buddha Tathagatas teach and transform only bodhisattvas. All that they do is always for this one matter. It is only to show and awaken sentient beings to the knowledge and insight of Buddhas. Shariputra, in order to expound the Dharma to sentient beings, the Tathagatas only make use of the one Buddha vehicle. There are no other vehicles, nor a second, nor a third. Shariputra, the Dharmas of all the Buddhas in the 10 directions, is also like this. So in this alternative example, we have the Buddha saying he only ever teaches bodhisattvas. And for our purposes, a bodhisattva is someone who will become a Buddha. He only transforms bodhisattvas. That means all beings that he teaches have the same capacity to become Buddhas. That is the only worthy goal of his disciples. And he only makes use of one vehicle of conveyance, one Buddha vehicle. This means that anyone hearing this message is ipso facto someone who can become a Buddha. I am awfully sorry to everyone there at the Swedenborg Library and everyone tuning in today. But because you have all heard this message, you will all become Buddhas. I'm sorry to tell you that. There's nothing I can do about it. This is the nature of the revelation at work here. Okay? Now, looking at these two examples, there is no way to pretend that these aren't two distinct positions. There's no way to imagine that this isn't a different exposition. And any Buddhist with sincere faith has to grapple with this. They have to make sense of this. So, even before Eastern Asians come on the scene, Indic Buddhist schools already tried their hand at coming up with solutions to this dilemma. On this slide, I've given two examples of the most famous Indian Buddhist Mahayana schools. On the left, the Madhyamaka, on the right, the Yogacarans. Now, on the left, the Madhyamakans, Nagarjuna specifically, came up with a system called the 4 Siddhantas or 4 methods. And this means that he believed the Buddha employed 4 methods of instruction, depending on what the circumstances called for. So in some sermons, he used what's called the worldly Siddhanta. In other words, he used conventional understandings of the world. He used conventional assumptions to describe Buddhist teachings. Naturally, in that case, he may not be explaining them as he would like to explain them. He's adapting them to worldly, non-Buddhist conventions. Another method that he employed was what was called the personal Siddhanta. So this is tailoring his message to a particular audience or individual. Again, this depends on understanding the capacity of the audience, not understanding things the way the Buddha sees things. The third method is called the corrective Siddhanta. So this is preaching that aims at destroying a particular defilement. Let's say that he comes across a community of people who believe in the immutability of the soul, and as an extension of that understanding, they believe they have a duty to free that soul from its tainted human vessel, its physical vessel. Well, he might employ what's called dependent origination to dismantle this attachment, this dangerous position. That is, he might explain that everything is conditionally arising. It comes from causes and conditions, always multiple causes and conditions, never a single cause. And therefore that it has no underlying substantive essence that can be grasped and held onto, which is independent of other causes and conditions. But naturally, he wouldn't use this corrective on an audience that is nihilistic, because this would only feed that issue. There's no underlying essence. This could be a dangerous approach. And finally, he employed what's called the supreme meaning Siddhanta. In other words, this is what the Buddha understood in his own mind. When the Buddha is not trying to adapt to an audience, he's saying it as a Buddha understands it. He is using this method. Now, looking at this model, you might notice then that probably Nagarjuna wants his disciples to use as their standard those texts which use the supreme meaning Siddhanta. On the other hand, the Yogacarans come up with this model of different periods of the Buddha's ministry. So they say, well, the first period of the Buddhist ministry is called the period characterized by existent substance. So in this period, the Buddha tells people that the individual is an aggregate phenomena. It is something made up of different parts. Another example maybe is a chariot. A chariot is an aggregate phenomenon. It's made up of wheels, yokes, seats, and so forth, right? And therefore, those aggregate phenomena, like people and chariots, are empty of underlying essence, but it doesn't necessarily say that those components, the wheels, the yoke, and so forth, are also empty of underlying essence. That would be the first period of the Buddha's ministry for the Yogacarans. The second period is characterized by emptiness. It pushes that boundary a little further. It says all of those underlying phenomena are also empty. There is no underlying essence to any of them, aggregate phenomena and their components. And finally, there was a period characterized by neither emptiness nor substance. And for the Yogacarans, this was exemplified in a text called the Samdhinirmochana Sutra. And this was an attempt, according to the Yogacarans, to get away from the nihilistic tendencies of emptiness on the one hand and the substantialistic the substantialistic position that emptiness was designed to combat. It's coming back, if you will, from those two extreme positions. Again, you can imagine that the Yogacharans think that it is this last period that is authoritative scriptures are from this last period. Both of these models are ones in which we establish some texts which are provisional teachings, they are for particular circumstances, and others which are ultimately true. So both models set up a picture of winnowing. There is a textual, scriptural winnowing that occurs. Schools become silos for the preservation of particular scriptural repositories, and the rest are largely jettisoned. They are only pedagogically useful in both of these models. And of course, they beg the question, well, is it dangerous to preserve and transmit texts which are partial, that are not ultimately true? Will they just cause confusion? Is it best to simply lay them aside? Now, this kind of model of jettisoning is thoroughly rejected by the Tiantai Tendai tradition in China and Japan. Our Chinese founder, Zhi Yi, on the left, reminds us that all of those sutras that we looked at on that very cluttered slide a few slides ago are true, not false. They ought to be believed. He said, everything, he says, but the sutras state from the evening when he attained the way until the eve of his nirvana, the dharmas which he expounded are all true, not spurious. It didn't say that a certain sect of texts were to be believed and others were illustrative. Instead, we found sutra after sutra saying, believe that which the Buddha has spoken. So Zhi Yi is acknowledging that there is very clearly cases where the Buddha adapts his message to target audiences. That's not in dispute. But he's not ready to disregard the words that keep occurring by his teacher, the Buddha, if there is a winnowing that happens as a result of this process. He's not ready to make that leap. All that the Buddha taught was true, not false. So whatever our vision of the Buddha's ministry might be, it has to be capable of reading all of these teachings, even the ostensible contradictions, as true, not false. Our theory has to be able to make not of the Buddha a liar, basically, is the concern. And on the left, our Japanese founder, Saicho, points out an added danger here, the danger of selective truth. And he particularly fingers those two schools that we looked at, the Yogacharans and the Madhyamakans. He says the Madhyamaka practitioners use the various treatises which are authored by Nagarjuna. They quote passages from all the sutras only to bring about the doctrines of their own school. And he says the same about the Yogacharans here. He says they both distort the texts to make them conform. They leave out what is contradictory to their school's positions and only pick up those texts which seem to confirm them. Obviously, as I'm sure we're all aware here as seekers of various spiritual or religious disciplines, genuine religious and spiritual growth usually occurs not in those elements which conform what we already understand, but in those that challenge them, those that don't fit evenly in that picture. So we set out to work out a vision that is able to do these two contradictory things. And Zhi Yi finds the text that will solve these issues in what is called the Lotus Sutra. He finds in that text the following remarks that we see at the top right here. For the sake of the infinite multitudes who revere me, I expound the seal of the true characteristic of all dharmas. Shariputra, you ought to know that I originally established a vow, desiring that all the multitudes be made equal to me and without difference. In line with that which I vowed in the past, I have here and now fulfilled it by transforming all sentient beings and causing them all to enter the path of the Buddhas. So the Buddha is plainly stating here that at the very beginning of his ministry, his intention was to make beings equal to him and no different. In other words, to tell them that they have the capacity to be Buddhas, that they are able to train in the one Buddha vehicle, no goal, other than that is worthy of the Buddha's disciples. And it uses this strange language to say, now and finally I've fulfilled that, because now I am expounding this text called the Lotus Sutra. So I've come back to this original aim after all these years. I am fulfilling it. He intends to imply that everything between that initial vow at the beginning and now at the end of his ministry was provisionally designed, just like we saw in the other models, provisional truths that are aimed to get people to understand what he always intended. And now he's able to fulfill that vow, to speak as a Buddha sees things, and the audience are in a position to understand that ultimate message, that ultimate understanding. So the Lotus Sutra, on the one hand, is acting as this unvarnished truth, this adjudicating position of those ostensible contradictions. But he's also wondering, does this ultimate message have something to say about its relationship to all those provisional truths? And what we find is that it does. It does. We're going to see that there is an unusual relationship between the ultimate message and the provisional teachings, which is going to save us from jettisoning what is provisional and retaining only what is quote unquote ultimate. Well, on the one hand, we do need, if there is a relationship between these things, to have a thoroughgoing understanding and system for delineating all of the teachings of the Buddha. Master Zhi wants to do this, therefore, by setting out a chronological table of the Buddha's ministry. He wants to be able to account for the methods at use. He wants to be able to account for the content of these sermons as well. So this is the threefold division that he will use to understand all of the provisional teachings and their relationship to the ultimate. So looking first at the chronological here, you can see in this table that the Buddha is understood to have taught the Lotus Sutra, this ultimate message, in the last 8 years of his life, but the rest of the provisional teaching, again, as well, can be divided. We have the first 3 weeks under the Bodhi tree, where the Buddha has a sudden outpouring of what he has realized to those who come and see him. This is collected in a text called the Avatamsaka Sutra, or the Flower Garland Sutra. After this period, this high language, highly philosophically charged language, outpouring of his instant awakening, he travels for 12 years as a wandering beggar, owning nothing and living on the subsisting on the kindness of others. And this is collected in the text of what we call the Agamas. Those are cognate with the Pali canon of the Theravadan school, for example. This is followed by 8 years during which he begins to expound the more philosophical propositions of his ministry again. It's includes texts like the Vimalakirti Sutra or the Golden Light Sutra or the Lankavatara Sutra, that other example that we saw earlier. And then we have what's called the Prajna period. Prajna means wisdom. So the wisdom period, and this is that period where we go into the depths of emptiness theory. So texts like the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, if you come across those texts, those are from this period, the Prajna period. And I've added this verse of memorization here. This verse is one that we memorize in our training so that we keep track of this. The Agamas 12, the Vaipulya 8, 22 years was Prajna discussed. The Lotus and Nirvana were together 8 years, and the Flower Garland was the first 3 weeks. So the Buddha attained awakening at 30 and he passed away at 80 years of age. So this divides those 50 years of ministry and attempts to explain all of those different periods of that trajectory. Then Zhi sets up a methodological framework. What are the different methods? Almost like we saw with Nagarjuna of the Madhyamakans earlier. So methodologically, the Buddha is said by Zhi to have taught sudden, gradual, concealed, and unfixed methods. He taught sudden, gradual, concealed, or unfixed in those manners. What does this mean concretely? A teaching is sudden in its method if it does not explain things in a gradual sequence. It does not lay out what is necessary to get to this understanding. It simply advises you of what is realized by a sage, by a Buddha, by an Arhat, for example. It also happens to coincide with that first period of the Buddha's ministry. In other words, where we had that sudden outpouring. As soon as he attained awakening, sudden is the method. There's no gap between the awakening and his preaching. He simply must expound what he has understood. So once again, it is sudden. And of course, a gradual exposition is the opposite. It's one that sets out the garden path one is expected to traverse. It builds upon what comes before it and anticipates what will come after it in its religious program. Now, the next two, the concealed and unfixed, are a little bit harder to grasp intuitively on the fly. But basically, the concealed method is when beings who are being instructed by the Buddha do not know what the other beings sitting next to them are hearing. So, for example, in that first exposition, the Flower Garland Sutra, we're told that different members of the assembly experienced different things. They heard different sermons and they saw a different assembly. Some of them saw wonderful, beautiful assemblies with garlands and devas, that is the gods from the heavens coming and paying respects, whereas others simply saw a assembly of human beings sitting with a man beneath a tree. There are two very different things happening here. That is what is meant by the concealed method, where the Buddha is exercising what we might call supranormal ability to preach different messages to different individuals. And the unfixed method is almost the same thing. It is where the crowd listening listen to the same words and hear different messages, but they are aware of the fact that the Buddha is teaching different assemblies, different messages. In other words, the Buddha is using his supranormal powers to allow them to understand that other beings are seeing and experiencing different messages, different things. That is an unfixed teaching, because it's neither one nor the other. Everyone is aware that there are distinct things. It is unfixed in its expression, in its method of expression. And finally, he develops a system of dividing the content. Okay, so he divides the content of the Buddha's ministry into what he calls the Pitaka, common, distinct, and perfect types of content. Now, the Pitaka here refers to the Tripitaka, the canon, and this is aimed primarily at those who want to be liberated from personal suffering. That is, they want to become arhats, but they don't necessarily want to understand the nature of existence and become Buddhas, because to become a Buddha means to have the obligation to teach other beings the path, to teach other beings the nature of reality. Then the next type of content taught by the Buddha is what's called the common teachings. So in other words, he uses the language that is common to the teachings that liberate people from individual suffering and that are common also to those who want to become Buddhas. He uses common language to explain across those two, if you like, opposing goals, to explain their aggregate similarities rather than their differences, in order to encourage people not just to seek their own individual liberation. You can do this. This is in common with what Buddhas do, but you should try and seek the fruit of Buddhahood. You shouldn't settle merely for your own liberation. Then we have the distinct teachings. They're called distinct because they don't use the common store. In other words, they are decidedly anti the goals of personal liberation. They say that trying to seek one's own liberation alone is almost a spiritual death, because someone will not continue to be reborn. They're liberated from existential suffering, and yet they don't understand the nature of reality in the same way a Buddha does. They do not have that omniscient understanding. They do not have that intuitive understanding of the nature of reality. Therefore, when they stop being reborn, it is a spiritual death. They will never become Buddhas because they have settled for a lesser spiritual attainment. So they are distinct teachings. They are only for those who are aiming for Buddhahood. It is distinct. And then the perfect teachings. The perfect teachings are those teachings which encompass everyone. They say, even when you thought you were seeking your own liberation, you were always really seeking Buddhahood. You just didn't know it yet. That's the way Buddhists teach. Everyone, perfect fit for everyone. These teachings encompass everyone. And naturally, this, of course, is exemplified for Zhi in this text called the Lotus Sutra, the one that tells us it was his original vow to make beings equal, and that he's now fulfilling that vow. But remember that our issue with the old systems was that they set up provisional teachings on the one hand and ultimate teachings on the other, where we can jettison that which is provisional and cleave to that which is ultimate. What is stopping Zhi Yi's system from simply falling into that dilemma? Well, the Lotus Sutra does far more than simply tell us that it's an ultimate teaching. It gives us a sense of its relationship to the provisional teachings. Let's have a quick look at a quote from the Lotus Sutra here. It says, utilizing the power of skillful means, all Buddhas discriminate and expound three within the one Buddha vehicle. Shariputra, if my disciples who call themselves Arhats or Pratyeka Buddhas do not hear and do not know the fact that all of the Buddha Tathagatas teach and transform only bodhisattvas, these individuals are not my disciples. And what's more, they're not Arhats and they're not Pratyeka Buddhas. So we'll go through the moving parts. But earlier we saw the Lotus Sutra say that there's only one Buddha vehicle, only one vehicle. And it might have seemed when we were looking at that first quote that what the Buddha is saying is that he originally taught three different goals, three different vehicles of teaching as a skillful dispensation, pedagogically, whereas now he's abrogating them. There's only one vehicle, that model is gone, we've got one vehicle now. It might have seemed that we're talking about some kind of abrogation. But looking to the present excerpt, we notice that it doesn't say he first taught three and then taught one. It doesn't say his disciples should just think of themselves as bodhisattvas and forget about the other goals of arhats and pratyeka buddhas. What instead it's claiming is that he skillfully taught three within the one. Within the one. Whenever he was teaching the three vehicles in the past, he was already teaching the one vehicle of the Lotus Sutra. And he tells his disciples that they can indeed call themselves Arhats and Pratyeka Buddhas, that is, people following these other paths and goals, but only if they know that precisely by being Arhats and Pratyeka Buddhas, they were also being bodhisattvas. If they don't understand this strange mechanism at work here, they are not his disciples. They're none of these things if they do not understand what's going on here. Now, before we dive too deeply in how this is made sense of, remember that we started by saying the authority of Buddhism, of the Buddha, is derived from his understanding of fundamental truths about the nature of reality. There is this strange mechanism at play here, which gives us an inkling of what the nature of reality is like for a Buddha. It's not the way it is for us, but it is this way for Buddhas. So it's incumbent upon us as Buddhists to try and make sense of this, to try and understand what that would mean. Common sense tells us that there's a three-vehicle model with multiple ends, and this seems to be a blatant opposite of the model that there is one vehicle and a singular spiritual goal. There seem to be two opposing poles. But when a Buddha looks at the nature of reality, he doesn't see it this way, right? He doesn't see this hard division between these two things. That means there must be something inherent about the other goals, arhatship, pratyeka Buddhahood, which is revealed to have always already been readable as Buddhahood and the one vehicle of the Buddhas. There is a strange mechanism going on here that we're about to break down. Very, very important. In all and every case, unbeknownst to the disciples, what they were really practicing was the one vehicle of the Buddhas, even if that's not what they set out to do. Even more so, in order to pursue the goal of Buddhahood, beings have to, in actuality, have been pursuing other aims. They have to have been doing the exact opposite of pursuing Buddhahood. This is strange. This is not, if this is striking you as unusual, it strikes even Buddhists as unusual. This is a mechanism unique to this particular sermon. Okay? There's something simultaneously going on here where there's a hierarchical distinction between three provisional vehicles and methods and one ultimate true vehicle on the other, and a mutual inclusion and identity of the two. The two things, the two claims are happening at one and the same time. Now, because this is an incredibly strange idea, I'm going to just go through a few examples from this scripture that might help us see how this is explained, if you like, in a down-to-earth fashion. The first parable I want us to look at is called the burning house parable. And the image on the left here is actually from that parable. It's an illustration. So please look to that as I'm giving you my summary of that exposition. So in this story, there is a father, and he's standing before his house, and he sees that his house is now on fire. Multiple fires have broken out in different places in the house, and he knows that his children are within the house. So he first yells to the children, "The house is on fire. What's more, if you don't come out now, you'll all be gravely harmed. Come out quickly and you'll be safe." But his children are playing with their toys. They're engrossed in play. They don't heed the father's words. They simply remain at play. So the father begins thinking about a way to get his children out of the house. And he remembers, yes, one of my children loves goat-drawn carts. The other loves a deer-drawn cart. And the final one loves ox-drawn carts. Much like children today, we play with toy cars. Well, these children have this predilection to play with carts. So now, instead of saying the house is on fire, come out, he says, "Hey, I have a goat cart, I have a deer cart, and I have an ox cart out here for each of you. It's just outside the gate. If you only come out now, you'll be able to play with the respective carts that you like." As you may imagine, the children simply run out of the house, vying with each other to get to their cart first. When they get outside, though, what they find is that there is no goat cart, no deer cart, no ox cart. There is only this one great white ox cart. And this cart is more beautiful than they could have imagined. It's better than all of those carts. It's bedecked with parasols, jewels, cushions, beds, delicacies, fragrances, the whole works. These carts are better than any of the carts that they intended to pursue. All of the children equally get this amazing, better than they had imagined cart. Now, the father is obviously the Buddha in this story. The Buddha's disciples are the children that have these various predilections and predispositions for different carts. But notice something weird taking place in the story. It is precisely by not seeking this great white ox cart that they actually attained this great white ox cart. They had to seek their deer cart, their goat cart, and so forth, in order to attain this one great white ox cart, this amazing, better than imagined cart. It's precisely by doing the opposite that they got their aim. If that doesn't quite get us fully there as far as how this mechanism is going, we have the next parable, the destitute son. Some scholars call this the Buddhist equivalent of the prodigal son, but you'll see as I go through that some of the details of the story are not quite the same. But again, you'll see some similarities there. In this story, it begins with a son who runs away from home, and he ends up homelessly wandering from town to town in search of work. He goes as a hired laborer. Now, in the many years that he's away, his father moves about and becomes a successful businessman. He becomes unrecognizably wealthy. One day, this lost son happens upon the mansion of his long-lost father. He sees the great opulence, the jewels, the wealth on display. He sees his father being waited on hand and foot. But this father is far different from the father he remembers leaving. He does not recognize that this is his father. What's more, he starts to think to himself, I'm a hired beggar. If I linger in a place like this, somebody is probably going to accuse me of stealing something. This is not a place for a person like me. While the son is thinking this, the father sees his son in the gathered crowd. And unlike his son, the father recognizes his offspring. And so he immediately tells two servants, that's my, go off and get that man, bring him to me. But all the son sees is these two servants running at him. He panics. Oh, yes, what I thought was going to happen has finally come true. They're going to accost me and I'm going to be punished. He faints in a cold sweat. The father watches all this happen. And so instead of simply waiting for the son to wake up and telling him, hey, don't worry, I'm your father, remember me, he tells the servants to take the son back to his hovel where he lives, What's more, he tells them to dress in very humble attire, to cover themselves in dirt. And when the son awakes, they are to tell him, hey, we're on a workforce. You're a laborer too, right? Let's work on this together. It's simple work. We're actually shoveling excrement, is literally what the text tells us. We're shoveling excrement. Couldn't be more humble. Do you want work? The son, of course, hears this proposition and says, yeah, sure, I do that kind of work. I'm happy to take on this work. The son works in that shoveling excrement, and he slowly is given more responsibility until one day the father comes to him again. The son still doesn't recognize him and says, you're a fairly astute young fellow. You work very hard. I think you should be my new manager, the new manager of my estate. That means you're going to know all of the belongings that we have in our storehouses. You're going to monitor all of the goods coming in and out. You'll count every penny that we have here. The son by now has slowly been given more responsibility and says, yeah, that sounds great. I'm happy to take on that position now. And he becomes the manager. A few years later, the father realizes, I'm quite old now. I'm not far off death. So he gathers all of the people that work for him together, all of his relatives, all of the people that know him in the town. And when they all come together, he drops the bombshell. He says, I'm close to death, and this gentleman here is actually my long-lost son. So when I pass away imminently, he is to inherit all of my wealth. Everything I own is his. All of my responsibilities, my business, my titles, they are his. He has been my son. He just didn't know it. He didn't know that he was my son. And it's at that moment in the story that the son realized, oh, okay, this is my dad. I remember now. I remember that was my father. Once again, notice the very strange mechanism at play here. The son worked beginning with the lowest labor, until he got to the stage where he was counting every penny of the household's goods. The whole time he was working, he thought he was working for and with someone else's wealth and opulence. But precisely by doing that, he was and always had been counting his own wealth. After all, a father's wealth is his son's. A son inherits what his father has. He doesn't somehow come into that. He's not given that as if he was being granted something. His father's wealth and mantle is his. So by pursuing something else, he achieved what was always his right. Okay? And the final story here is the parable of the doctor and children. So in this story, we have a famous doctor, and he has some children, and they go into the father's pharmacy. They begin to play with his medicines, and in the course of their play, these silly children end up taking a medicine which, applied inappropriately, is fatal. They're crazed, they're out of their mind, they don't have their wits about them. The father tells them, you must take this medicine, but they're delirious, they're half crazed, they do not listen to what he has to say. So the father manufactures a situation. He tells them he has to travel away to treat a patient. When he's away, he sends them a letter saying that he's met with misadventure and has unfortunately died. The children are knocked from their deliriousness and beside themselves in pain. They say, oh my goodness, our father is dead. How can we honor him? Well, his last words were that we should take this medicine. Let's honor his dying request. And they take the medicine and they're cured. The father then returns home, revealing that he was not dead and that he'd manufactured this whole situation. Notice the strange mechanism here. He's a doctor and a father. The role of a doctor is to heal the people before him. And we might say the role of a father is to be there, literally, for his children. But in order to perform the role of a doctor and of a father there, he had to not be there. He healed them by not healing them. He was their father and he was there for his children by not being there. His absence made him more present. The opposite of being present made him more present. This is strange. This is an unusual mechanism. This is not what we find in most Buddhist sermons. Now, this mechanism, this funny thing that's going on here, is the basis for what in Tiantai Tendai is called inherent entailment. Okay? It's sometimes called mutual entailment, and if you read modern scholarly material, it's often called intersubsumption or holistic intersubsumption, subsumption rather. And it's this mechanism. This is a term to describe this strange mechanism. Now, this on its own we could talk about this for 1,000 hours, okay? It's a very interesting concept. What I want to do is try my best to keep this simple. I will give a little bit of philosophical jargon and language just for those who are interested in that. And then I will explain why it's relevant to this understanding of the ultimate truth and the provisional sermons that seem to contradict the ultimate truth. How is that related? So, in philosophical language, this doctrine of inherent entailment is the idea that X and the non-X, the things that are not X, are always in contrast, which makes them non-dual. Okay? X is in fact integral to, or non-X is integral to what makes X X. A simple way of understanding this is perhaps when I say that is a cat, you understand that is a cat because in your mind you see the thing and your definition of cat already includes everything else that it is not. It is not a dog, it is not a person, it is not a cart, it is cat. The identity cat includes its opposite, always and forever, immanently in its proposition. Whenever non-X then is excluded, if you say, this is just a cat, I don't care about the non-cats, right, as it were, if you put it in a vacuum, it loses its identity as a cat. Cat on its own without reference to every non-cat is meaningless drivel. No, nothing, there is no context frame to put it in. It is no longer meaningful in itself. The meaning that it derives in itself is dependent on the meaning it gets from the non-its that are there, okay? Every entity at every point in time that has ever existed is simultaneously itself and readable as an instantiation of every other thing that has ever existed, okay, in time and space. Okay, now I know I'm condensing a lot here. So I know that I'm asking a lot by condensing it in this way. But this quote here brings us back to how this relates to teachings, provisional, temporary teachings, and ultimate teachings. In this quote from the Lotus Sutra, we have, all good sons, the sutra scriptures which have been discoursed by the Tathagata are all for the sake of liberating sentient beings. I speak of myself sometimes I speak of others, sometimes I indicate myself, and sometimes I indicate others. I indicate my own deeds, and sometimes I indicate the deeds of others. All that I have said and expounded is true and not spurious. There's that expression again. Okay? That means what? When the Buddha in other sermons elsewhere says existence is suffering, the Sanskrit word is dukkha. We translate it as suffering, but it really means oppressive. In other words, existence is oppressive. In a simple sense, if you exist, you are oppressed by existence because you have to clean yourself, wash yourself, clothe yourself, keep yourself in good working order. If you don't do those things, you will really suffer. There is an oppressive nature of existence. When the Buddha says that elsewhere in other sermons, he was telling the truth. But when he says here, actually, all phenomena in existence are blissful, they are nirvanic, the exact opposite of suffering, he is also telling the truth there. When he says that all beings are deluded and ignorant, that is true. And then when he says here, all beings are Buddhas, that is also true. The nature of existence is such for a Buddha that all events, functions, characteristics, phenomena are simultaneously what they are in their limitedness and all other things. Okay? Existence is always irreducibly multiple and irreducibly singular. Okay? Right? And this is how we can say it's multiple here. Sometimes I talk about myself, sometimes I talk about others. But all of it is true. Everything I've expounded is true, i.e. unitary, from a singular enlightened mind. Remember we saw he taught three within the Buddha vehicle. Okay? So this is the Ekayana, or the one Buddha vehicle that the Lotus Sutra is talking about. It's not about this juxtaposition between three vehicles and then one vehicle over here. We call this one vehicle a sublime dharma, a difficult to understand and believe dharma, because it's precisely this strange mechanism. When it comes to the teachings then, let's say you're a Buddhist, you wander the path, you come to the Lotus Sutra, you come to the understanding the Lotus Sutra explains things the way Buddhists see things. Well, do you want to follow the Lotus Sutra? Then it is by pursuing the provisional teachings, the non-Lotus Sutra teachings, that one in fact does so. You cannot jettison them. They are integrally necessary. If you remove the Lotus Sutra from its context of all of the non-Lotus Sutra teachings, it loses what makes it sublime. It's just another provisional truth. It loses what makes it sublime. Now, if you go out and read the literature, there's a lot of material on this topic by as I mentioned, the University of Chicago professor, Dr. Brooks Zipper, and he's very good of putting this into contemporary philosophical language and explaining it to people who are not necessarily embedded in Buddhist terminology. So if you do want to look at that, I do recommend his work. Now, he calls this, in one of his books, this mechanism, he says the Lotus Sutra's main mechanism is not really knowing what you yourself are actually doing. Okay. And this is, I think, I don't know for certain, but I think it is his reworking of an expression that appears multiple times in the Lotus Sutra. So in the Chinese, it's 4 characters, bu qiu zi de, and it means they received it without seeking it. They received it without seeking it. What they received is not what they thought they were going to receive. What they were pursuing is not what they actually were pursuing. Okay? And this doctrine is absolutely crucial to the entire Tiantai system. When we looked at that division of periods, methods, and content of the Buddhist teaching, this is what makes sense of it. This is why our doctrinal classification system does not allow us to privilege the Lotus Sutra then and jettison the rest. And I heard Del mention at the beginning of the talk that last year you all had a Nichiren monk give a talk. And of course, they also think the Lotus Sutra is, if you like, the ultimate expression of Buddhism. But we differ on this point. We differ on this point. Theirs is an exclusive devotion to the Lotus Sutra, whereas we interpret the Lotus Sutra in this way. We see this mechanism, and for us, they have to be both unitary and distinct. There is a hierarchical distinction on the one hand, but also a unity that we cannot do without. We cannot jettison one and leave and cleave to the other. And although it's a little bit beyond our short talk, all of these derived strange-sounding positions of our school here, what are called the 3 truths or tripartite truth, the inherent entailment of good and evil in Buddhahood, the Buddha nature of the insentient, and the 3,000 things in a single thought moment, all of these things that sound strange, and when you go out after this talk perhaps and try and pursue these in detail, will sound intuitively bizarre. They are based on this mechanism that we saw in these Lotus Sutra parables, what we call this inherent entailment. Inherent entailment. And on the left bottom there, I won't read it out, but this is why a later Tiantai master in China, his name was Zhili, said here that this single word entailment is the essence of our school. If you want to boil down what is it about the Tiantai Tendai school that allows it, on the one hand, to be incredibly comprehensive, and on the other, to be incredibly devoted to a single text like the Lotus Sutra. How do we square that away? It is found in this concept of entailment. And therefore, briefly in our closing there, because we have the broadest possible sense of the doctrine of Buddha Dharma, we naturally have the broadest possible sense of what it means to cultivate, to practice in Buddhism. And we have a system called the 4 samadhis that we use to contain all Buddhist practices of any kind. Samadhi is usually a term that means a meditative equipoise. It's reference to the state that comes out of contemplative activity. But it's used here to refer to all practice, both ritual and meditative, if you like, because, after all, it is the ritual containers that give contemplative practice their form. And in the opposite direction, it is contemplative practice that makes ritual norms and practices not merely going through the motions. The two, once again, are two sides of the same coin in this inherent entailment kind of mechanism. And the four different types: constantly sitting, constantly walking and partially sitting, neither walking, neither sitting. Constantly sitting encompasses any religious practice wherein one is stationary and seated. Sitting on a cushion, doing a ritual practice, reciting text where you're seated, all of this is part of this category. Constantly walking is the opposite. If you do walking meditation, or you do any kind of practice that's in motion, so for example, if you do prostration practice, you are standing and then you are going down to the floor. That is a movement. You are constantly moving. So that would fit in this category. Partially walking, partially sitting is for all of those things that don't fit in those neat categories. So, for example, a central practice for us is called the Lotus Repentance Rite. During that practice, we recite sutras while seated for part of it, and then we stand up and we circumambulate the shrine and so forth. So we're doing both. We're walking and we are seated. And then finally, this last rather cryptic, neither walking nor sitting. That is all of those practice things that are happening when you're not doing formal practice. Washing the dishes, walking the dog, feeding the baby, in the traffic. It's all practice, but you're neither sitting nor walking. It's not formally defined in such ways. This is perhaps the hardest kind of practice. And again there, I've just put at the bottom there that there were elements to Japanese Tendai that were not part of Chinese Tiantai. And I mention that not to say that Tendai is different. We understand ourselves to be the exact same school. We are Tiantai, Tendai. Those two words mean the same thing. But I pointed out just to say that this tradition has always been adaptive because of this doctrine. It has always been able to absorb things that were not questions that the Chinese founder had in front of him. Esoteric Buddhism, for example, was not something that was fully transmitted to East Asia by the time the school was founded there. But it was when it was transmitted to Japan, and therefore it was absorbed into this schema. The Bodhisattva precepts is also unique. Again, a different disciplinary system came into place. And naturally, Shinto. Okay, anyone who's clear on Japanese Buddhism will know that until the modern period, the two camps, if you like, of Buddhists and Shintoists, if I can use that word, is a little bit anachronistic, but the two were not seen as distinctly different. The Japanese kami were understood to be manifestations of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in Japan before there was any reference to Buddhism. It wouldn't make sense for them to say we're Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. There was no reference. And so they now have, if you like, a symbiotic relationship where the kami of Japanese Shinto are seen as protectors of Buddha Dharma in Japan. So there is a union of those two things. They are inherently entailed, if you like, to use that term. Okay, I understand that that was a bit of a whirlwind tour. I apologize if some of my explanations perhaps were not easily digestible, but I hope at least it was an interesting journey. And again, you'll notice what I tried to do was not say, here's the three truths, here's this doctrine, here's this doctrine. What I tried to do was give you the framework. Where do we start? The Buddha says everything is true, not false. There are contradictions, and therefore we have to, on the one hand, be able to adjudicate between those contradictions and therefore have some ultimate adjudicator like the Lotus Sutra, but there is a relationship between adjudication and that which it adjudicates. The measuring stick has a relationship to the thing that I measure. Yes, okay, and I'll pass it back to our friend Del there, and of course, any questions, please don't hesitate.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Can you stop sharing, and then we'll
sure. Sorry.
then we'll all come back in.